delighted all the way from the West Coast that Robert's with us here in Wimbledon tonight. Robert Beshara. Robert's particularly known as the author of decolonial psychoanalysis towards critical Islamophobia studies. But he's done so much else as well. He's editor of the Critical Introduction to Psychology and founder of the Critical Psychotherapy website, Critical Psychology website. So, Robert, thanks so much for taking part this evening here. Perhaps can I leave for you to introduce your talk?
Sure. Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. It's good morning here in Santa Fe, New Mexico, but good evening to you all, wherever you may be in the world, mostly in the UK, I think. Thanks for the invitation. So the title of my talk today is The Other Side of Abyssal Psychoanalysis. I want to share an image which will be central to the text throughout my speech. And I call this The Master's Discourse and Its Bloody Shadow. So that's the name of this figure. So this essay is written from the perspective of and in solidarity with analysans as an attempt to think critically about psychoanalysis beyond the gatekeepers of power and knowledge, be that in the form of analysts qua masters or psychoanalytic institutions qua universities. This is an intervention at the level of praxis, which undermines psychoanalytic approaches that privilege theoretical knowledge over practical ethics. Why do we continue to hear about ethical breaches involving abusive analysts, as well as institutions that come to their defense to protect their image by silencing the victims? Is it hard to imagine the clinic replicating the oppressive dynamics existing within a given society, particularly in the global north? Is it impossible to consider the history of colonization vis-a-vis the invention of psychoanalysis in the late 19th century in the context of new imperialism, especially the scramble for Africa? These practical questions concern politics and ethics because the clinic is neither an ahistorical entity nor a neutral space that exists in a vacuum. The clinic is a psychosocial space wherein what is psychically repressed is linked to what is socially oppressed, or as Jacques Lacan put it succinctly in seminar 14, the unconscious is politics. While the subject of psychoanalysis may be normative in theory, for he is often perceived to be civilized, i.e. male of European descent and bourgeois, the subject is far from normative in practice. Therefore, only through a critical understanding of the field, from the perspective of female, non-European, and proletarian analysans, can psychoanalytic scholars and practitioners reconnect with the field's radical potential. But to do so is the work of decolonial critique, which is my task here. The radical potential of psychoanalysis is grounded in two basic principles: ethical listening and free association. Ethical listening means listening to the unconscious of the speaker, which requires a certain level of compassion or empathy, and is not a question of overinterpretation, i.e. wild analysis. In other words, ethical listening entails practical ethics much more than theoretical knowledge. The analyst's lack of ethical listening correlates to reports from analysans of abuse in the clinic. This abuse is a result of the link between theoretical knowledge and mastery, which is what Michel Foucault referred to as power knowledge and what Lacan identified in terms of the university and master's discourses, the former being always subservient to the latter. Subsequently, the analyst is not supposed to embody an ontological or even epistemological position of mastery, but simply an ethical function within a specific clinical context vis-a-vis the analysand, who does most of the work of analysis. For example, Lacan founded and dissolved several analytic schools because of the members' transference in relation to him as the analyst qua absolute master. Further, institutions in general tend to function aggressively like an eagle while forgetting about their unconscious, that is, what they institutionally repress. Therefore, psychoanalytic institutions that encourage silencing or censorship are paradoxically non-psychoanalytic, for they essentially embody the complete opposite of the principle of free association, which should only be limited by the confidentiality binding the analyst to the analysand. My attempt here is to theorize the historical conditions which give rise to the ethical breaches we continue to witness today within the clinic and within analytic institutions. Psychoanalysis is not outside these historical conditions, for example, colonialism. Therefore, anyone who is interested in psychoanalysis, both as a theory and as a practice, has a responsibility to sustain fidelity to the field's radical potential, particularly from the perspective of oppressed analysands. My dialogue with these analysands is the ethical and political background driving my concerns in this essay, which is dedicated to them. I draw on the work of Boaventura de Sousa Santos, particularly his notions of abyssal thinking and post-abyssal thinking, in an effort to distinguish between abyssal psychoanalysis and post-abyssal psychoanalysis. Santos's overall project is to critique dominant, i.e. Euromodern, epistemologies from the perspective of the Global South, which is not an argument for the superiority of epistemologies of the South, but rather an argument for ecologies of knowledges. While his focus is on epistemologies in general, I am interested in psychoanalytic epistemology in particular, because I find it, with its emphasis on the unconscious, to offer both a powerful critique of psychology as well as a complex theorization of subjectivity. In my own work, I qualify psychoanalysis, regardless of type, as post-colonial, because in its different iterations from Freud and beyond, it is primarily a critique of modernity from within. Whether it indexes critical modern or postmodern discourses in order to perform this critique. In other words, post-colonial or abyssal psychoanalysis exemplifies a Euromodern rhetoric, which is sustained by a colonial logic, the unconscious of psychoanalysis. However, many of the important insights of psychoanalysis, for example, the unconscious, desire, enjoyment, fantasy, etc., warrant delinking the field's epistemology from its unconscious colonial logic. For example, regarding the primitivity of the non-European other, this is the task of decolonial or post-abyssal psychoanalysis, which entails a transmodern critique, that is, a critique of modernity from its alterity, in an effort to ground the praxis of psychoanalysis in a decolonial or worldly logic. Delinking also leads to a pluriversal verification of psychoanalytic epistemology, which is different from the colonial tendency to universalize what is provincial. For example, in relation to theorizing the subject. To put it differently, the Euromodern subject of abyssal psychoanalysis is not a universal subject. On the other hand, the transmodern subject of post-abyssal psychoanalysis is a pluriversal subject. By abyssal thinking, Santos is referring to how dominant Euromodern epistemology makes non-European human and non-human realities invisible, or even actively produces them as non-existent. For this reason, he qualifies dominant epistemology, of which psychoanalysis is one example, as an epistemology of blindness. Ranjana Khanna makes this dimension of epistemological blindness vis-a-vis psychoanalysis explicit in her important book, Dark Continents, wherein she writes, the concepts of self and being that came into existence in psychoanalysis were dependent on strife or violence, that is, on the politics of colonial relations. Post-abyssal thinking, and consequently post-abyssal psychoanalysis, then involves shedding light on these unconscious colonial logics, which inform modern fields of knowledge in an attempt to delink modernity from coloniality and therefore ground our theorizations of the subject in a cosmopolitan sensibility, which I have referred to recently as ContraPunto Psychoanalysis. In the words of Santos, post-abyssal thinking is a non-derivative thinking. It involves a radical break with modern Western ways of thinking and acting. In our time, to think in non-derivative terms means to think from the perspective of the other side of the line, precisely because the other side of the line has been the realm of the unthinkable in Western modernity. In this essay, I extend Santos's analysis by conceiving of this unthinkable line in terms of a further bar in addition to the one familiar in Freudo-Lacanian psychoanalysis, i.e. the bar that splits subjectivity into ego and unconscious. I attempt to point to an other bar, which is the repressed unconscious of psychoanalysis itself. I also refer to this other bar as the bloody shadow of psychoanalytic epistemology. And I demonstrate my thesis through a critical analysis of Lacanian discourse theory, particularly the master's discourse, which is what we're seeing shared on the screen. Signifying this other bar can help us account for the doubly split subjectivities of those who were socially excluded since the beginning of psychoanalytic epistemology, that is, non-Europeans, be they indigenous, Black, or global Southern. These non-European subjects were historically and continue to be split not only by Euromodern discourses, but also by the materiality of colonization, enslavement, overexploitation, racism, etc. Repressing that colonial materiality manifests itself as a fantasy that sanitizes modernity from this traumatic real of violence and oppression, and of course frames modernity as civilizational. Traversing this fantasy is the central task of post-abyssal psychoanalysis. What then is on the other side of abyssal psychoanalysis? On the other side, one encounters only non-existence, invisibility, non-dialectical absence. I am referring here not to modernity as the master's discourse, but to its double or bloody shadow, which ideologically and phantasmatically sutures the real of coloniality. Following Santos, a post-abyssal psychoanalysis then consists of the symbolic amplification of signs, clues, and latent tendencies that, however inchoate and fragmented, do point to new constellations of meaning as regards both the understanding and the transformation of the world. The two characteristics of post-abyssal psychoanalysis are subaltern cosmopolitanism and ecological thinking. Before I unpack these concepts, I shall now turn to a critique of abyssal psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis as a type of modern Western, read abyssal thinking, is caught up in a dual modern cartography, a legal cartography and an epistemological cartography, represented here by S1 and S2 respectively. This dual modern cartography, with its two main forms of radical negation, i.e. negating what is beyond universal or European conceptions of true, false, and legal and illegal, results in a radical absence, the absence of humanity, modern subhumanity. Subhumans are those who are positions as spectral subjects below the abyssal line, separating Euromodernity from the colonial zone. Its repressed other. Subhumans are doubly barred because they represent both the foundation of abyssal thinking and the negation of the foundation. In other words, the colonial zone is repressed in both senses of the word, the political and the psychoanalytic, respectively. For this reason, we're currently witnessing, particularly since the rise of neoliberalism or global racial capitalism in the 1970s, the return of the repressed, qua the return of the colonial and the return of the colonizer. The return of the colonial takes one of three forms: the terrorist, the undocumented migrant worker, and the refugee. In this sense, we can speak both metaphorically and literally of the abyssal bar, qua cartographic lines, borders, fences, walls, etc., which sustain the appropriation, violence paradigm in the colonial zone. However, since the colonial zone today is often an endo-colonial zone, as is clear from apartheid policing in the global north, the appropriation violence paradigm, which used to be restricted to exo-colonial territories, has been seeping for decades into the regulation emancipation paradigm governing modern social reality, particularly because the abyssal lines today are not as clearly defined as they were in the 15th century. Regardless of their definition, they are still operational, albeit invisible, and as such, they inform modern theories and practices grounded in abyssal thinking, such as post-colonial psychoanalysis. Furthermore, Santos characterizes the return of the colonizer in terms of both new indirect rule, or the privatization of the commons, and the rise of social fascism. Because the colonial zone is radically negated, the colonial subject is a homo saucer living in a state of exception, wherein anything goes since he or she is positioned in an extra-legal zone, such as Guantanamo. This state of exception is especially evident in terms of the appropriation of and violence against indigenous and/or Black subjects in settler colonial societies, which Virilio qualifies using the term endo-colonization. Consequently, the Black Lives Matter movement is a swerving from endo-colonial appropriation and violence. Lacan's formalization or mathematization of psychoanalysis, as exemplified by his use of algebraic symbols and diagrams, such as the one I'm sharing with you, can be read as a form of abyssal cartography, since the juridical epistemological bar, which pushes the modern subject below the master signifier, occludes another bar, the abyssal bar. The abyssal bar is a function of the cartographic lines that were established as part of the historical imperial process to justify property rights over occupied lands and enslaved peoples. Santos writes, the first modern global line was probably the Treaty of Tordesillas between Portugal and Spain in 1494, but the truly abyssal lines emerged in the mid-16th century with the amity lines. In other words, the metaphoric barring, i.e. symbolic imaginary castration of the modern subject, is premised on the literal barring, i.e. real castration of the colonial subject. Or as Santos puts it, the metaphorical cartography of the global lines has outlived the literal cartography of the amity lines that separated the old from the new world. As a result, the symbolic imaginary order, for example, the Euro-modern reality of psychoanalysis, is rooted in the global spiritual order of Christendom, which rests on repressing the non-European real. The colonial subjects of the non-European real, who are exterior to modern knowledge and law, include Jews, Muslims, indigenous peoples, Africans, Asians, etc. Having said that, psychoanalysis includes within itself a post-abyssal potential because its founder, Freud, was Jewish, and Frosch even reads psychoanalysis as decolonial Judaism. Nonetheless, because Sigmund Freud struggled throughout his life to assimilate into an anti-Semitic Viennese society, he internalized some of that society's abyssal thinking, and specifically racism, which he clearly struggled with, as is obvious in his last book, Moses and Monotheism, written in the context of Nazi Germany's annexation of Austria. Edward Said's final text, Freud and the Non-European, highlights how identity, as theorized by Freud, is paradoxical since it is based on non-identity, given that the founder of Judaism, Moses, was an Egyptian. Said's reading of Freud's last book allows for a liberatory figuration of non-identity politics, or an identity based on politics and not a politics based on identity. Whereas the former identity is articulated through the both symbolic alignment of desire and real jouissance, the latter identity is nothing but méconnaissance, since it is premised on imaginary identifications, which are shot through with narcissism and aggressivity. The first identity manifests itself in terms of solidarity and comradeship around common demands. The second identity is caught up in the seductive games of representative democracy. While psychoanalysis may exhibit abyssal thinking, Lacan's concept of the real affords a reading of the colonial zone, or the zone of non-being, as the colonial real. The colonial real is the realm of incomprehensible beliefs and behaviors which in no way can be considered knowledge, whether true or false. The modern symbolic imaginary order radically excludes the colonial real and produces it as non-existent. Consequently, Santos regards the negation of non-European humanity to be the founding negation of modernity, whose function is sacrificial in that it is the condition of the affirmation of the other parts of European humanity, which considers itself universal. Therefore, psychoanalysis, as a postmodern rhetoric, is logically built upon an abyssal fantasy, which sutures the colonial real, its bloody shadow, while the hysterics and the analyst's discourses hold within them the potential for generating counter-hegemonic discourses vis-a-vis the university and master's discourses, respectively, psychoanalysis, repression, and repetition of the colonial real, incomprehensible subhuman territory, renders the distinctions between the four discourses superfluous and may even lead to the analyst discourse functioning unconsciously as a master's discourse. That being the case, psychoanalytic theorists and practitioners must delink the field's modern rhetoric regarding knowledge and law from its colonial logic, a delinking which entails traversing the abyssal fantasy. The colonial real refers to what is beyond modern Western thinking, in particular beyond modern knowledge and law. The colonial real is the invisible foundation of the symbolic imaginary order, or the modern world system, which is the common global order since the colonization of the Americas. I chose to critically analyze the master's discourse as opposed to the capitalist discourse because the former is foundational juridico-epistemologically from both a historical and cyclical perspective. As Lacan shows, the university is always in service to the master, but even the analysts in hysterics discourses as critical discourses that challenge both mastery and the commodification of knowledge respectively will eventually circle back to the master's discourse through the generation of new master signifiers. Not mentioning how the hysterics production of critical knowledge can eventually become co-opted and commodified by the university in the context of racial capitalism. This is the paradox at the heart of Lacanian discourse theory, which is a challenge for any utopian sociopolitical process of liberation. Furthermore, my theoretical treatment of the master's discourse involves an innovation with my conception of the discourse's bloody shadow, which is the specter of a silenced discourse returning like the ghost of Hamlet's father. In other words, my argument in short is that while psychoanalysis has a liberatory potential, which can be designated as post-abyssal, the praxis can also slip into a discourse of mastery, where its knowledge of the unconscious can become commodified as a function of its colonial unconscious, which is the bloody shadow of psychoanalytic epistemology. The subject of psychoanalysis is the modern subject, i.e. the metropolitan man who entered the social contract in order to abandon the state of nature to form civil society. The modern subject is always constructed in relation to its negated other, colonial objects, i.e. savage peoples or the state of nature, where civil society's institutions have no place. Consequently, can psychoanalysis account for colonial subjects beyond their objectification as phantasmatic objets? And is the analyst as a structural embodiment of the objet, taking the place of a non-European other in order to functionally cause the desire of the European analysand? As a result, accounting for decolonial subjectivity entails moving beyond the abyssal thinking of modernity coloniality and towards the ecological thinking of liberation psychoanalysis. In other words, the question of cultural and colonial difference is at the heart of psychoanalytic epistemology, given its sociology of absences. It is not scientific to universalize what is provincial, while repressing what is other, hence the necessity for thinking pluriversally about subjectivity and the unconscious. Liberation psychoanalysis is post-abyssal because it is grounded in subaltern cosmopolitanism, which is a cultural and political form of counter-hegemonic globalization, and the name of the emancipatory projects whose claims and criteria of social inclusion reach beyond the horizons of global capitalism. One of the features of liberation psychoanalysis is post-abyssal thinking, which is a non-derivative thinking that involves a radical break with modern Western ways of thinking and acting. Post-abyssal thinking is thinking from the perspective of the other, that is, the colonial real or the realm of the unthinkable in Western modernity. While Lacan is correct to argue that there is no meta-language that can be spoken, I add that there are other languages. To put it differently, there is something to be said about the cultural specificity of psychoanalytic epistemology, given how its knowledge was historically transmitted through particular languages, such as German, English, French, etc. Post-abyssal thinking is learning from the South through an indigenous African, Latino, Latina, Asian epistemology of the South. It is an ecology because it is based on the recognition of the plurality of heterogeneous knowledges. Santos adds, the ecology of knowledges is founded on the idea that knowledge is inter-knowledge. A good example of post-abyssal psychoanalysis in the context of cultural and linguistic specificity is Omnea Shekri's excellent book, The Arabic Freud, Psychoanalysis in Islam and Modern Egypt. Santos writes about the hegemonic I, which ceases to see and indeed declares as non-existent the state of nature. This hegemonic I, which is located in civil society, is also the hegemonic I of psychoanalysis, its ego or consciousness. For example, Descartes' ego cogito, wherein thinking equals being. Therefore, the state of nature, or the colonial real, is the abyssal unconscious of psychoanalysis, which exposes the repressed ego conquero and ego extermino, at the root of the hegemonic I's false being. Not mentioning that Lacan's account of alienation, non-meaning as a compromise between the subject's being and the other's meaning, leaves out the historical imperial facticity of non-being. Colonial objets, who are most often non-European, are those on the other side of the abyssal line, that is, those living in the colonial zone of non-being. Frantz Fanon was the first theorist to author a post-abyssal psychoanalytic account of the damned from the perspective of and by someone located in the zone of non-being, i.e. the French colonies of Martinique and Algeria. Fanon's dialectical account grounded and hence critiqued psychoanalytic ideology in the real of colonization in an effort to emphasize the primacy of decolonization as a permanent revolutionary praxis for collective liberation beyond racial capitalism. In other words, those of us who are attracted to psychoanalysis must seriously think about the relationship between psychoanalysis, the modern state, and racial capitalism as functions of the historical imperial process. Since that relationship can never be neutral and will always be political, why must psychoanalytic theorists and practitioners shy away from the implications of an anarchist non-relationship, such as free association? Liberation or post-abyssal psychoanalysis actualizes multiple spatio-temporal configurations of psychoanalysis, and as such decenters modernity, i.e. the here and now, along with its conceptions of barbarians, i.e. those living in the periphery or exterior to modernity, and primitives, i.e. those living in the past or in pre-modernity. Jacques Derrida characterized the spatio-temporal hegemony of abyssal psychoanalysis with the signifier geopsychoanalysis. Said's discussion of imaginary geography and historical knowledge as aspects of Orientalism is relevant in this context too. Additionally, Santos writes about the non-contemporaneity of what is on the other side of the abyssal line, which gives the hegemonic I the ability to make up pasts to make room for a single homogeneous future. The post-abyssal alternative is what Santos calls radical co-presence. That is, equating simultaneity with contemporaneity, which can only be accomplished if the linear conception of time is abandoned. Luckily, psychoanalysis presupposes a nonlinear conception of time, as evidenced by the concept of Nachdenklichkeit. However, are the analyst and the analysand contemporary in equal terms? In other words, can we characterize their relationship in terms of radical co-presence, particularly given the impossibility of the co-presence of the two sides of the line? This impossibility of co-presence is what I term colonial difference. Hence, we can assert that there is no colonial rapport. Is psychoanalysis open to the epistemological diversity of the world? In other words, are we able to delink psychoanalysis from modern abyssal thinking? Situating psychoanalysis within an ecology of knowledges entails a commitment to counter-hegemonic globalization, which is a post-abyssal praxis of anti-capitalism, anti-racism, anti-fascism, anti-sexism, decoloniality, transmodernity, liberation, etc. To put it differently, counter-hegemonic globalization involves transcalar resistance against racial capitalism. Santos writes, trans-scaling presupposes a certain unlearning of current criteria of relevance determination. It invites us to consult social reality through different cognitive maps operating at different scales. The learning process consists in raising the consciousness of the limits, contrasting representation with orientation, position with movement without getting paralyzed. A higher consciousness of limits is at the core of the kind of prudent knowledge I am proposing here. a form of knowledge that teaches us how to keep consequences under the control and within the sight of the actions that cause them. In psychoanalytic terms, transcalar resistance is none other than the ethical political link between the singularity of being inside the clinic and the ecology of knowledges outside the clinic. Transcalar resistance or critical unconsciousness is the basis for cosmopolitan solidarity among the subaltern. This subaltern cosmopolitanism will necessitate intercultural translation, which is not without contention, as Santos shows. Furthermore, psychoanalytic interventions must be pragmatically and ethically assessed using an epistemology of consequences, which follows the principle of precaution. According to the principle of precaution, preference must be given to the form of knowledge that guarantees the greatest level of participation to the social groups involved in its design, execution, and control, and in the benefits of the intervention. In other words, there is no such a thing as a neutral psychoanalyst. Neutrality is an ideological position, for it means being uncritical of modernity coloniality. Given psychoanalysis's beginnings with Freud and developments since Freud on the Euro-modern side of the abyssal line, these are some of the questions that we must wrestle with if we are to move beyond abyssal thinking and towards ecological thinking, particularly since the universality of knowledge and law is never applicable to the damned, who are rendered disposable and fungible, given their exterior status vis-a-vis civil society. The abyssal line structurally blinds the civilized masters to their bloody savagery. If the modern subject of metropolitan societies is barred, as Santos asserts, by the universal socio-political paradigm of regulation, the community, the state, the market, versus emancipation, the aesthetic expressive rationality of the arts and literature, the cognitive instrumental rationality of science and technology, and the moral practical rationality of ethics and the rule of law, then the colonial subject of the colonial territory is doubly barred by that visible social reality, i.e. the symbolic imaginary order as a common global order, along with an invisible dichotomy: appropriation, incorporation, cooptation, assimilation versus violence, physical, material, cultural, and human destruction. The subject of psychoanalysis is the modern civilized subject. Hence, the colonial subject does not exist, except as either a spectral, divided subject or as a commodified objet. For this reason, we must superimpose the four discourses with four more discourses, their uncanny doubles, to account for both modernity and its colonial other, that is, the other of the other. This other of the other is exterior to the modern other of knowledge, i.e. scientific, philosophical, and religious truths, and law, i.e. legal versus illegal. It represents other forms of knowledge, popular, lay, plebeian, peasant, indigenous, as well as other as non-law, lawless, illegal, non-legal, non-officially recognized law. The other of the other in this sense signifies pluriversality, i.e. an ecology of languages, and does not signal the existence of a universal meta-language. Incidentally, mathematics is the meta-language of modern science, which is interesting to think about in view of Lacan's attempts at formalizing psychoanalysis. Moreover, both others are barred, for no other can say it all. But while the modern other is visible, the colonial other is invisible, so it is doubly barred like the colonial subject. The colonial other, as the ghost in the machine, is the logical foundation for the rhetoric of the modern other. However, this logic, as a product of the historical imperial process, is invisible because of how modern discursive fantasies, particularly regarding the universality of knowledge and law, unconsciously suture the specter of the colonial real. Unlike the visible rhetoric of regulation emancipation, which acknowledges the law of persons, the invisible logic of appropriation violence only recognizes the law of things, e.g. non-European human as thing. For this reason, we must pay attention to the jouissance of jouissance, or the enjoyment of enjoyment, that is the surplus jouissance of racial capitalism, that is the extraction of value, knowledge, and enjoyment vis-a-vis racialized bodies. In some post-abyssal psychoanalysis, as situated within an ecology of knowledges, is driven by what Santos calls action with Klineman, Clean man signifies neither revolutionary action nor a dramatic break. Rather, it refers to a slight swerve or deviation whose cumulative effects render possible the complex and creative combinations among living beings and social groups. Post-abyssal psychoanalysis does not refuse abyssal psychoanalysis. On the contrary, it assumes and redeems the past by the way it swerves from it. Its possibility for post-abyssal thinking lies in its capacity to traverse the fantasy of the abyssal lines. The cosmopolitan subject of post-abyssal psychoanalysis is endowed with a special capacity, energy, and will to act with Klineman. He or she is driven to swerve from Euromodernity toward transmodernity as an ecology of knowledge and legal practices. To end on a concrete note rather than an abstract one, I shall reference 3 recent interventions that exemplify what I've been calling post-abyssal psychoanalysis throughout this essay. Sheldon George's 2016 Trauma and Race, a Lacanian study of African-American racial identity, Patricia Gerovici and Christopher Christian's 2018 Psychoanalysis in the Barrios, Race, Class, and the Unconscious, Daniel Jose Gastambide's 2019 A People's History of Psychoanalysis from Freud to Liberation Psychology. These interventions and other ones I have not mentioned typify post-abyssal thinking as a praxis, for they critically engage psychoanalysis through what Santos calls an epistemology of seeing, which inquires into the validity of a form of knowledge, such as psychoanalysis, whose point of ignorance is colonialism and whose point of knowing is solidarity. In other words, my transmodern decolonial argument in this essay has basically been, don't throw the baby, psychoanalysis, out with the bathwater, colonialism. Thank you very much.
Robert, thank you very much. Thank you. So now throw it open, please, for questions, comments.
The only thing that I was wondering about that came up was I kept thinking of Deleuze's the rhizome when you talked about ecology of knowledge, and I wondered about Deleuze and the rhizome as a way of different entry points into knowledge and different branches of knowledge, and that something about a principle of not knowing potentially where you start from, but not knowing where the other starts from, and that as a principle to be open to different knowledges.
Yeah, I do like that metaphor, that image of the rhizome, because it is very close to free association, which is a horizontal concept that's ideally non-hierarchical, right? So there's definitely something to that. I agree with you.
Can I? Well, thank you. I thought that was absolutely fascinating, and it seems that there is this kind of emerging field of Lacanian African studies that is happening now. That seems very exciting. And you spoke about Frantz Fanon earlier, and he probably was maybe the first Lacanian who started to deal with subaltern subjectivity. And it also brings to mind what you said about the subaltern and this the graphic. It makes me think of Chakrabarti Spivak, and when she says that the question is not the question is not why the subaltern doesn't speak. Ultimately, the question is why we cannot hear what they say, and maybe that's what comes back to not to throw the psychoanalysis with the bathwater, but it returns the question to us. Are we? Can we really hear the non-European, non-white subject when they speak to us?
Yeah, and I think what I try to show, there's a structural problem within psychoanalysis itself that prevents that listening. So there's a case study that I hint to in the paper, but I can talk more about it since many of you are clinicians, right? Is that fair to assume? So there's an ethical breach that happened with somewhat famous psychoanalyst, and the analyst reached out to me with share what happened and the sort of abuse that took place in the clinic. And it was actually recorded, and there were transcripts. I was able to listen to it and look at the transcripts and speak with the analyst about their experience. And I don't talk about this case study in detail in the paper, but it was definitely a big part of what inspired me to think through some of these questions. Why is it that a famous psychoanalyst who has written many books and is very knowledgeable still commits ethical breaches that are completely unacceptable by any standards? And somehow psychoanalytic institutions are not able to deal with it, right? So that's kind of like the central problem. And then I spoke with other analysts, and they shared with me, this is around the world, by the way, not just in the US, and in Mexico and different parts of the world, that this is common. These things happen, and they're somewhat systemic. And why is it that they happen? And I try to think about it theoretically and historically, that there's a reason. That doesn't mean that there's something that's plaguing psychoanalysis from within itself. We can think about it as the unconscious of psychoanalysis. That's how I think about it. And we can pretend that it's not there, and approach psychoanalysis ideologically, or we can really reflect deeply and critically on why these ethical breaches continue to happen. And even with analysts, particularly with master analysts, I mean, that's the key thing here, this concept of mastery, and also how knowledge can be abused, right? So you could write many books about psychoanalysis and still, in terms of practical ethics, not the best human being, right? So that's really the sort of the practical core that's motivating the essay for me. But obviously on the clinical side, but I'm also concerned with outside the clinic in terms of how psychoanalytic theory can work as a university discourse, as a form of knowledge that can explain things and help us interpret the world, right?
Robert, hi, thank you very much. That was really great talk and interesting. But I have the same question that that was asked in Paris in 1968 during the kind of student riots, and are you just looking for another master?
Mm-hmm.
Or are you just trying to make it kind of problematize what the master is, in a way?
Yeah, I think this is the tricky part. The cyclical nature of how discourses function is we can hystericize master signifiers, but ultimately the kind of critical knowledge that we produce will create new master signifiers that can then somehow replicate oppressive processes that we were trying to change. This is kind of the historical problem of revolutions, right? It's literally a cycle where one group replaces another with the ideal that things will get better in terms of social change. But often we see that there's a repetition, right, of oppressive dynamics. There's an internalization of oppression to begin with, and then there's a repetition. So that speaks to the enjoyment of oppression and violence too. Again, if I think this is kind of the problem that I faced with my first book, is when I was thinking about decolonial psychoanalysis, I did come face to face in the concluding chapter with this problem of, well, the end of critical knowledge is new master signifiers. That's the kind of the limit of language, and but at the same time, so is there a way out of that? In other words, that's another way of asking that. I think yes and no. There's repetition, as we know, again from the clinic and outside the clinic, is structural feature of subjectivity, right? It's a structural feature of enjoyment. It's a structural feature of the drive, how the drive functions, right? So what's the way out of that? And I tried to imagine in the second book that I wrote, the sequel to Decolonial Psychoanalysis, that perhaps the utopian move is to maybe going back to the first question, to think about more about the free association, more about horizontal affiliation, more about rhizomatic relationships. Because if you look at all the discourses that Lacan presents are structured in a hierarchical way, right? So the one that I shared with you today, you can see that the S1 is on top of the divided subject, right? That's the nature of discourses in general. And perhaps the bigger question here is that that's the nature of subjectivity, of the unconscious, how it works. So I think it's a complicated question that doesn't have an easy answer, and it's something that I definitely struggle with intellectually. And yeah, thank you for your question.
I was also thinking in terms of Kristeva, the abject. Are you talking about something that's been made abject, like through all sorts of, discourses? I mean, she says there's something to do with the mother is made abject, something to do with women. Does that come in at all as well?
Yeah, I mean, I'm familiar with Kristeva's concept of objection. I do not use it in this framework, but I could see it working as well. I mean, it could be one form of reading for sure.
I suppose in some ways part of the issue is the move to knowledge. We're always moving to knowledge. And I guess with Kristeva, what it makes me think is the constant, a constant reconstitution of meaning. It doesn't really allow you to take up the knowledge in some ways. And I think maybe that's part of the problem, that we're always creating knowledge as opposed to creating more questions, creating more space, creating more. And so for me, it's about a movement away sometimes from knowledge, something other that we don't know what we're doing there really, but we're there, and to see what comes of that at times.
Absolutely, I agree with that, because that's actually in the beginning I talked about theoretical knowledge and practical ethics, and the importance of ethical listening. So the analyst that was abusive, he, and it's obviously a he, right? He wasn't able to listen because he has so much knowledge about psychoanalysis. I mean, I looked at the transcripts, I was listening to him. All of this knowledge that he has is preventing him from listening. So he has too many interpretations, and obviously very arrogant and confident, and he says very problematic things to a female analysand. And not only that, there was an element of sexual harassment, and I mean there are many levels to it, right? So that's when it became obvious to me that yeah, that's an example of someone that has theoretical knowledge but doesn't have practical ethics. right? So I speak about that also in the paper in terms of the commodification of knowledge, which, Lacan refers to that in terms of the university discourse. And that's always subservient to mastery. So again, here's an example of someone who's really a master pretending to be an analyst. And that's a trap within psychoanalysis, right? That's a trap that Lacan pointed to, but it doesn't mean that he was able to always avoid it, because he was an example of an absolute master in many ways, right?
Yeah.
And I just add to that, maybe, sorry, Miranda, just add to that, maybe that's why he said that the analyst should be in the position of the one who's supposed to know, that you don't actually know. So if you take up the position of actually knowing, then that becomes very unethical.
Absolutely.
Sorry, Miranda.
No, I was just going to say, I'm just really grateful to the paper. I've been working with quite a lot of people that are second generation immigrants, and I feel like, I don't know, it feels like there could be a kind of double abuse there in terms of people I deal with. Their families are kind of against some of the culture which their children are born into, but the children are in the culture of their parents, but also they're trying to sort of get away from that by living in the UK. And then I'm thinking about coming to therapy, and then you have another, ignorance of that colonial other, but then our clients then almost sort of fitting in yet again in some way that's kind of abject thing, really. That kind of sense, like a double. I don't know if I'm explaining myself well enough, but there's something else going on there.
Right, so a sort of dilemma. I mean, the way I would think about that, it's kind of like one of the beautiful things about psychoanalysis, but a blessing and a curse. The fact that the clinical focus is on the singularity of the subject. So regardless of background, and so obviously background is important, culture is important, language is important, all these things are important because they affect the unconscious. But at the end of the day, members of a similar social group still have a singularity in terms of how, their unconscious is expressed and all of that, in terms of their symptoms. And so that's the blessing and the curse of like, I think the singularity is an important thing, because the question of cultural difference is an important question, but it's not a translatable question.
No,
the difference, right?
If we're not aware in what I think your work is the non-European, if that's not in our psychoanalysis, if you like, then it's being ignored, isn't it? It's not. That makes sense.
Well, I think my main issue is that the subject of psychoanalysis as theorized, who is considered universal, is the modern subject that was theorized by Descartes, right? And what decolonial scholars show is that conception of modern subjectivity, which we still use today, is based on an actual historical reality of colonization. Like, you don't come to that conclusion without that. So that's the part that's usually not talked about and ignored. And so, and obviously because of that fact, that subjectivity, that theorization does not include, non-European subjects. And so non-European subjects are excluded from psychoanalytic theorization ipso facto. And so what that leads me to the question of, do we abandon psychoanalysis then, or is there a way to stretch psychoanalysis? So I'm for the position of stretching psychoanalysis.
Well, by listening to a paper like yours, really, for us to wake up to our blindness, perhaps, in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, that my point is, again, because some individuals will go to the conclusion of rejecting psychoanalysis after this analysis. That's not my position. My position is, I have these critical concerns, but I still think that psychoanalysis has something to offer, and therefore, how can we stretch it in such a way that it can account for other forms of subjectivity?
Could you say more, please, with regard to that and what you mean by practical ethics? I'm not being clear what you said there. I suppose I've heard you talk something about something like the otherness of the other, or something like this, which reminds me of Levinas. And I wonder what distinction you would make with Levinas's notion of ethics and your practice.
I think that one of the I mentioned this briefly in the paper, but one of the things that really attract me about psychoanalysis is the importance of otherness within it. You know, the otherness of subjectivity. Even modern subjectivity, with all of its problems, there's still otherness within it, right? Psychoanalysis has otherness within it. There's difference that cannot be translated. There's the unconscious, right, which cannot be fully translated. The ethical dimension has to do with that position of non-knowing, as was mentioned earlier. I mean, I think about it in terms of ethical listening, and ethical listening from a position of learned ignorance. That's another concept that I like, learned ignorance, because in my first book, one of the things that, for example, I came across, my first book deals with Islamophobia, right? And sometimes the liberal response to, let's say, the conservative position of Islamophobia is to be Islamophilic or Islamophilia, right? Like the complete, the other extreme. And that can come across as also another form of racism, right? So it's complicated. So the position of learned ignorance is the position of, again, it's the old Socratic position of, I know that it's a form of knowledge, but it's a paradox.
Is it an attempt not to know? A bit more, you know, for example, acceptance rather than knowing. Is it not? Right?
Or knowing the limits of knowledge. How much am I able to know about the other? And I, you know, even knowing about my own otherness, and it's more of a questioning than having answers. Once we try to fill in answers, as someone was saying, commodifying knowledge, then we're on the wrong path, because then we're in the path of the ego, where we think we know, and we have stereotypes, and we're thinking ideologically and all of that. The position of curiosity is the position, I think, of analysis, is the position of learned ignorance. This learned aspect is important. So it's not crass ignorance, it's a learned ignorance.
Do you then think that your paper is trying to help people come to a place of sort of learned ignorance, or do you think it's trying to sort of teach European people how to sort of go, sort of as random I've been saying, sort of waking up, and how to then sort of see sort of people who are from, you know, backgrounds where there may have been, you know, colonialism going on. Do you see what I'm saying? I don't know if I'm expressing myself.
I'm not hearing very well. It's cut a little bit, but I think, were you asking something about learned ignorance in the paper?
Yeah, and whether you're today, you know, in your paper, you're trying to sort of tell maybe other clinicians how to be in their practice, instead of this way, be this way.
I think it's less of telling people how to be, but more of showing the reader these dimensions that are implicit within psychoanalysis, as I say, the unconscious of psychoanalysis, which has to do with material things and has to do with history. and trying to shed light on them so that we have a better grasp of the complexity of the situation that we're facing today, which, you know, if we ignore those things that I'm talking about, then we're going to continue to see the repetition of oppression, not just within the clinic, but also overall. And if we're interested, excuse me.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I wanted to say that the unconscious of the psychoanalysis is its will for mastery.
Sorry, can you say that part again, the last part?
The unconscious of psychoanalysis is its will to mastery.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Closing the gap.
Knowing, having the answers, being a unified subject.
And I mean, part of my curiosity has to do with also the fact that why is it that psychoanalysis appears in the late 19th century in Vienna as opposed to any other place in the world or any other time? And so, you know, the historical context, the historical conditions are interesting to me. And then, of course, the intellectual history that leads to the ideas, right? So Freud, in many ways, represents a bifurcation, I think, the bifurcation of psychoanalysis itself. I mean, the split subjectivity is central to a concept in psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis itself is split, right? And it does have a radical potential, which I'm very interested in, but it also has this reactionary side. And that reactionary side denies all the things I talk about. I think there's a question on Zoom.
Yeah, yes. My name is Anthony Stadlin. Isn't there a reactionary element in your constant talk and the Lacanians' constant talk about the clinic and clinicians? What is all this about? I'm a psychotherapist, but I'm not a clinician. I'm not a health professional. This is a primary mystification. I mean, it mystifies the capitalist West, and it mystifies colonialized people. It's the major mystification, and you're colluding with it by talking about clinicians and the clinic. When people come to see me for psychotherapy, they're not coming to a clinic. They're not mentally ill. I'm not a health professional.
Okay, so you have a problem with the term itself, but the way I'm using it...
I don't have a problem with it at all. It is a problem. I mean, it is a stupid term. Lacan is stupid to use this term. Lacan is perpetuating the myth of mental illness.
Yeah, I disagree with you, but it's okay. I don't think that's how he's using it.
Well, it's certainly how he was using it when he dealt with Dora Maar to suck up to Picasso. He dealt with her in the way that any banal psychiatrist deals with awkward characters. I mean, it seems to be a terrible thing, a terrible colonialist thing, if you're to spread Lacan's rubbish, you know, not to confine it to France and Europe, but to spread it all over the world. That's not decolonializing. That's Lacanian colonialism.
I mean, that's your interpretation.
Yes, it is.
What was that? Sorry, what was that example that you just gave, Anthony, about the banal psychiatrist's response to awkwardness? I don't know anything about that.
Dora Maar.
Yeah.
Oh, it's quite well known. Picasso wanted to dump Dora Maar, and so he called in his pet psychiatrist, who was Lacan, who diagnosed her and sent her to a psychiatric institution obediently for Picasso.
Okay.
I think that
Yeah, so
Right.
go ahead.
Robert.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, you know, Lacan was a very problematic historical figure. So like many figures in the 20th century who, you know, founded schools of thought or what have you. And, you know, I'm very critical in my work, but to dismiss everything as rubbish, as you say, I don't agree with that position for sure.
Well, no, of course, I'm putting it rather provocatively, just to present a different dialectical position. I'm not so stupid as to see nothing good in Lacan, obviously.
Do you think, Anthony, that maybe one way of putting what you've said, maybe it's watering it down too much, is that maybe we might pause a bit at the idea of Lacanian African studies or something like that. Lacanian African studies seems to be a bit problematic in that, you know, if it sounds that it could be something quite colonial. It sounds, you know, that it's
that's what I'm trying to say. Yes, yes.
You could at least have African Lacanian stuff.
that would be
Yeah.
more interesting.
Well, I think the question, maybe the bigger question, like whether it's Lacan or someone else. I mean, again, the same could be said about Freud. I mean, many people, as you know, reject Freud and have a lot of problems with him. So this could be extended to Freud himself or others. So the bigger question is, if we find, let's think of any thinker that has been influential. If we have problems with, you know, some of their ideas of some things that they have done in their lives, do we completely reject them, or do we use what we find useful for our analysis and then critique them at the same time? And this is an open question, and, you know, people take different sides of this. So I've met people that feel very strongly about psychoanalysis being colonial and totally. Like, there's no way to decolonizing psychoanalysis, and that it should just be rejected and Freud should be rejected. And that's a popular position today. And
Could I just, sorry, please forgive me, but could I interrupt? That's it's not my position that, you know, that we should reject Freud or reject Lacan at all. But I'm just arguing that we should be clear-sighted in trying to use them. And I mean, I've spent a great deal of my life really trying to sort out the wheat from the chaff in Freud, but the people who invoke Lacan seem to invoke him rather uncritically. This is really my point. I'm not at all opposing the idea of using what is valuable in Lacan to understand anything, including understanding colonialism and helping colonialized people. But I particularly find this adoption of this jargon of the clinic by you and by others, I find that, to use the jargon, problematic. Or, I mean, I actually find it offensive to the people who come with existential problems to treat them as if they're coming to a clinic, as if there's something wrong with their health. This is a fundamental miscategorizing of people. And if that is going to be exported to what used to be called the third world, then that is a terrible form of colonialism in itself.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you seem to have a strong reaction to that specific signifier.
Certainly.
And
very strong.
Yeah, and that's clear. And
but I don't regard that as a part of my psychopathology, a strong reaction. It's a strong ethical, political opinion.
Sure. And we can have that could be like a whole other debate about, you know, this concept and its genealogy. And so that's one thing you picked out of what I said, but again, as the way I'm thinking about it, it's not the way you're thinking about it. So and I agree with you regarding the uncritical sort of dealing with any master uncritically, and so that's an ideological position, and I agree with you on that. But regarding the concept of the clinic or that signifier specifically, it doesn't mean the same thing that it means to you for me, the way I'm using it. But anyways, that's a whole other debate.
My take on the use of clinic, I might be completely wrong, was I thought you were speaking of the implications of external factors, socially, political, economically, that turn it into the clinic, that make it into this place that Lacan is speaking of, as opposed to saying the clinic. My take of what you were saying was there's all these factors that shape it, that make it, and actually the closest term perhaps we have to the description of these of these factors is potentially the clinic.
Why?
That's what I picked up. That's what I thought.
But why the clinic? I mean, Freud in I think it was 1928, he wrote a book, the question of lay analysis, in which he emphatically insisted that psychoanalysis was not a medical discipline. He thought that Freud thought that America was a gigantic mistake, and he was confirmed in this belief by the fact that the American psychoanalysts insisted that their psychoanalysts should all be doctors, and Freud thought this was true. Right. Freud thought this was appalling.
I'm aware of that. Yeah.
And Freud's idea of a training institute for psychoanalysts was not that it should be a medical school. It should be a college or institute where they taught anthropology and religion and sociology and literature and so on. He saw psychoanalysis as he said it's a form of weltliche Seelsorge, worldly spiritual counseling. What's that got to do with the clinic?
Right. I mean, you have all these associations with that signifier, but as I said, for me, it simply signifies a space where analysis takes place. So whether this analyst is a medical professional or a lay analyst, it still applies. Even whether they're, psychoanalytic psychotherapists. It's kind of a generic term for a place where analysis happens.
Well, please don't use it about the place where my analysis happens. I regard it as offensive, as offensive as Black people regard certain terms that are used to describe them.
All right. Are there any other questions or comments?
Yeah, can I sort of just put a little bit in to make matters worse? Maybe, I'm sure, but I think there's lots of really interesting things in your paper. There are a couple of people, of course, I've never heard of and that I really want to hear about. did you say what was the person's name? Sheldon George, and I'd like to know what the title of that paper is, and I'd like to sort of chase it up. So there's that, and
right.
And the things you were saying about I suppose that psychoanalysis having, I suppose, this potential, as it were, for something radical, something that is incredibly useful. But of course, the difficulty with psychoanalysis generally, and with Lacan, I think, is that there's a tendency to believe in psychoanalysis, and I think that's different from being able to engage with psychoanalysis, to make use of what psychoanalysis can help us to do. I think if we believe in it, then there's something about, we don't really understand something about it. We're not thinking about, believing things has got perhaps something to do with what we're invested in and what it means in relation to us, etc. That's not the place to be. A different place to be might be something about, how does it help us to question the things that we tend to sort of assume. But I want to come back though to what Anthony is saying, and I think actually it's a pretty important argument. I think because there is something now happening about decolonizing the medical curriculum, both doctors and psychiatrists, and about the checking the spread of the pharmaceutical industry, which is getting its hands on the rest of the world in a way. And I think the whole thing about clinic or not clinic is very related to all of that. There is a way of seeing of sort of the West sort of medicalizing the whole sort of way of talking about people's well-being, which I think camouflages what the West does, what it stands for. And it's a way of sort of pushing the West's thinking and its drugs, to put it that way. So I'm just...
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, to begin with the last point, it's I'm a research psychoanalyst actually, so I'm affiliated with the Lacan School of Psychoanalysis in San Francisco, and I use Lacan. I identify as somewhat as a Lacanian, but I'm also have my own take on things, and even disagree with Lacanians, right? And so I'm an example of a lay analyst. So again, when I know that it seems that the term is charged, and I think it's good to think about it. What that term is doing for us as a group, right? It's producing a lot of associations, and it's something definitely for us to pause and think about, and perhaps it's something I can clarify in terms of how I use it. But to your second point, so there's a scholar called Gabriel Tupinamba. He's from Brazil, and he actually has a really nice book on ideology within psychoanalysis, specifically on Lacanian ideology. So this point about not questioning the master and believing in psychoanalysis to such an extent that I guess it becomes a religion, paradoxically. So that's definitely something that I'm critical of, and I have this kind of love-hate relationship with Lacanian psychoanalysis. As to your first question, the book is called Trauma and Race, Lacanian Study of African-American Racial Identity by Sheldon George. So his specialization, he's a literary studies scholar. And so he sort of hones in on the concept of rhizome or enjoyment in psychoanalysis and Lacanian psychoanalysis in relation to historical trauma of slavery and the effect of that on the subjectivity of African Americans and he analyzes specific books you know, such as Toni Morrison's Beloved, etc. And so there's a kind of a theoretical aspect to it, but then a part where he's applying the theory to different books. And so he's a colleague of mine, and I recommend the book. It's definitely an enjoyable read.
Good, thank you, thank you. I'll try and find it.
Thank you.
Any final questions people have got?
Just thank you. It was good. Great talk.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening.
Yes.
Yeah,
Well,
thank
Robert,
you very much.
Thank you, because it seems like just so important for us, you know, to really be looking at decolonizing psychotherapy from our perspective, psychoanalysis, or, you know, whether I'm sure Nancy may agree, whether it be existential analysis or whatever, you know, we can get caught up, and the danger is it can become totalizing moves, yeah? And so there is, I think, the great danger that Anthony's pointing out, that in the name of decolonizing, it's another sort of colonization project if we're not careful, yeah? And so
Absolutely.
I think you're raising that question about, you're saying, yes, as I understand it, Robert, but at the end of the day, you still think that psychoanalysis and Lacanian analysis has something to offer decolonization.
Yes. Yes,
Well,
I do.
Thank you so much for opening this up for us, and very, very great.
Thank you, everyone. I appreciate it.
Could I just say that our next, we have on this particular program, we're particularly interested in critical existential and analytic psychotherapy, and this term is looking more at the critical elements of it. And our next speaker is Anastasios Gaitanidis, who's talking about hearing other voices, the ear as the eye of invisible class oppression, and that's on Saturday the 13th of May. Our final talk on the 8th of June is by Manu Bizano, who's looking at psychotherapy as subversive art. So there's two adverts for a couple of future talks. So many thanks, and thank you for our visitors coming along today. We're now taking on this program a half-hour break, and hope to see you another time. Thank you.
Thank you.